homosexual, between marriage between homosexuals and adoption of children by gay couples. So when I was a law student at Penn, several decades ago, actually, my law review comment was called homosexual marriage, a constitutional test and a legislative proposal. That's what I wrote about. No one was talking about that issue then. And it was quite interesting, actually, interviewing at law firms that summer after I had written the piece, because this wasn't a topic that particularly large corporate type law firms in Philadelphia, which is a kind of, a little bit of a staid conservative East Coast city we're used to. And I remember receiving from one of the partners at one of the firms I was interviewing at a little personal note, and he wrote in there, "This was like the most interesting 15 minutes I had in the whole day of interviewing." So anyway, I'm proud of that. And I always I teach one of my courses is family law, and I tell my family law students that because, of course, now, that's one of the gay marriage case is one of the main cases that we cover in that class. And I always tell them about my history with that. So, all right. So people often ask me, well, how did you come to write a book, Remixed Judaism, that's really, it's really about how religiously liberal Jews, which, by the way, I define as anything from the conservative movement of Judaism all the way to the left of renewal and beyond. Okay, very, very big tent. How did you come to write a book, about this topic? Truth to tell, my background as a legal academician, as a legal scholar, is really an intellectual property. I spent quite a few years actually writing about copyright law, also kind of a good fit for a congregation that's based in LA. And so how did we get from here to there? And the story is actually kind of an interesting one. So I wrote many, many law review articles about the doctrine of moral rights. That's a copyright doctrine. What that doctrine does is basically guarantee to an author, the author of any kind of creative work that's protected by copyright law. So it could be art, literature, music, anything is protected by copyright law. So the doctrine of moral rights really looks at when does that author have the right to attribution, to have their name featured in conjunction with their work. And more importantly, for our purposes, what if that work is modified, changed? How much modification can occur and it not be the work of the author? It becomes something different, right? So I wrote about that question in many, many different articles, as well as the book, The Soul of Creativity, is actually about the doctrine of moral rights. Incidentally, for those of you creators, and we're all creators, who are interested in the United States, we do not have protections that will guarantee most creators attribution and protection from their works being modified without permission. We are pretty much alone in the world with respect to that law. All right. Anyway, I wrote about that a lot. And one day I woke up and I had this eureka moment. And it was sort of like, wow, couldn't we use that same question? How much can it be changed and still be what it is? Couldn't we apply that to Jewish tradition? And I thought this would be a really cool idea to explore. How much can Jewish tradition change and still be Jewish tradition, right? So that was really this idea. I became captivated with this idea. And I was still working on the book, The Soul of Creativity, about moral rights, but I decided to kind of pitch this concept as a book to Oxford Press. And they loved the idea, and they actually gave me a contract. And so the myth of the cultural Jew is really about the evolution of Jewish law, of halakha, Jewish law, as it's been influenced and modified and changed over the course of millennia by the surrounding cultures. And so it really looks at that question of how much can Jewish law change and still be Jewish law, but it looks at it from a very academic perspective. Oxford is a publisher that likes a lot of footnotes. It's an academic book. But toward the end of the time I was writing The Myth of the Cultural Jew, a report came out which shook the Jewish world to its core. That report is known as the Pew Report from 2013. There was a lot of hand-wringing that basically occurred in the wake of the 2013 Pew Report, because basically what the 2013 Pew Report showed is that the vast majority of American Jews, who I define as religiously liberal, are basically not practicing Judaism. And there was a lot of concern for what does this mean for the future, in particular, of American Jewry. So I was really interested in that topic. And I knew as I was finishing that book, and my last chapter in The Myth of the Cultural Jew is actually on American Judaism in its current form, again, from an academic perspective. But I knew that I wanted to write a book that really was prescriptive. By that, I mean that was really geared toward a wide audience, not just, scholars and rabbis and law professors, but a wide audience, because what worried me then, and it still worries me now, and the Pew Report of 2020 actually just came out 2 months ago, right? And so the concern that I had in 2013 is still, I would say, even more present than it was in 2013, because Pew is showing us, the 2020 Pew is reaffirming that we are quickly heading toward a situation in terms of American Jewry in which we have a pocket of Jews who are very observant, living completely within the system of Jewish law, of halakha. But on the other hand, we have the remainder of Jews, the majority of Jews in the diaspora here, 85% of American Jews, who are basically doing less and less and practicing less and less. So to me, that situation where you have religiously liberal Jews that are basically not practicing Judaism at all, not tapping into our wonderful, beautiful Jewish tradition, that to me is something that I want to talk about. And I wrote the book, The Myth of the Culture, I wrote the book Remixed Judaism in order to share. It's a guidebook for primarily religiously liberal Jews who are not living completely within the system of Jewish law, for how they can deepen their own connection to Jewish tradition, and also how they can transmit that tradition down the line. And it's important to emphasize that transmitting Jewish tradition down the line is not something that only people with children, biological and other children, have to be concerned with. Because I think the majority of people actually have younger people in their lives, whether they're children or whether they're grandchildren or whether they're nieces and nephews, and just special younger people in their lives with whom they have a relationship to some degree. There's so many opportunities for everyone to try to shape the Jewish journeys of the next generation, whether they're children or some other type of relationship. And so I think that Remixed Judaism is really written from the perspective of how can individuals deepen their connection to Jewish tradition? How can parents and others inspire the Jewish journeys of the next generation, and how communities can actually come together in order to deepen this connection, when the idea is that people are not going to be living in strict accord by what I call dotting the I's and crossing the T's of observing Jewish law. So that is the reason that I wrote Remixed Judaism, and that is really the goal in terms of the book. So again, my perspective is that Jewish tradition makes life better for us as individuals, and that the world is a better place generally because of Jewish tradition. And by the way, not just for Jews. This year, actually, my law school, which actually happens to be a Catholic law school, it's Catholic with a small c, meaning that it doesn't dominate the curriculum, but it is nonetheless a Vincentian school, wanted me to come up with a course on social justice and Jewish legal tradition, right? So I have come up with that course. I will, when I do teach it, it won't be this year, hopefully in the future, I will be teaching it largely to non-Jewish students, because we don't have a tremendous number of Jewish students at my particular school. And so again, that's taking our Jewish wisdom, our Jewish tradition, and making it accessible to a wider group of people, which is something that I'm very, very committed to doing. So the need to find meaning in Jewish ritual really lies at the heart of my remixed approach to Jewish tradition. And I'm going to share with you what the elements of that remixed approach are and give some examples that I will hopefully allow you to tap into what it is that I'm really trying to accomplish here. So I start with the premise that religiously liberal Jews, again, by and large, are not going to be observing Jewish tradition because they are commanded to do so. All right, now, I do discuss faith in God in Remixed Judaism, particularly in the epilogue of the book. But my approach to Jewish tradition is not dependent necessarily on faith in God one way or the other. Jewish tradition, Judaism is a religion of action. It's a religion of practice, first and foremost, I think. And so therefore, faith or dogma is not something that I focus on to any great extent. But it is also true that religiously liberal Jews, by and large, are not going to do something just because they are commanded to do it, just because it is the way to do it, or it's the way it's always been done. And by the way, this sentiment was articulated not just by me, okay, but even the former chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Chancellor Arnie Eisen, made essentially the same observation in a piece that came out actually after Remixed Judaism was published, in which he said that in the entire time that he was the chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he would go from one synagogue to another and visiting, many different congregations, many conservative, but also many reform as well. And he said in his article that it's not uncommon for Jews to engage in behaviors that are not warranted by their beliefs. And he said this is true even for himself. And he said that, people don't necessarily care about the explanations that are officially attached to the rituals, but they still find their own meaning or some great meaning in the prayers they utter and the actions that they perform. And this idea of finding meaning, your own personal meaning in Jewish tradition, is one that I think is so very important. And it really lies at the core foundation of the concept of Remixed Judaism that I write about and think about and talk about. So what are the components, okay, of Remixed Judaism? Let's talk about that for a little bit. So first and foremost, consistent with what I've just talked about, that people aren't going to do something just because they're commanded to do it, because it's the rule, because it's the law. That doesn't resonate with most religiously liberal Jews. So they will exercise individuality in terms of what rituals and traditions they elect to incorporate in their lives. All right, there's picking and choosing, and that is just reality. Okay, so that's first and foremost. But equally important is that people must infuse into those rituals that they do perform their own sense of personal meaning. People will perform ritual if it means something to them. If they can find a value to it, they will perform it. And so therefore, that infusion of personal meaning into what they're doing is so critical. And part of this actually goes to the elements of mindfulness and intentionality, which are really key aspects of a remixed approach to Judaism. And I will also say that although I did not envision an orthodox appreciation for my book, because some of what I write in there, is not exactly, again, in accord with dotting the I's and crossing the T's of Jewish law, right? But what I've seen is that there are many Orthodox people that appreciate what I'm doing. People who do outreach, kiruv, like, for example, Chabad type organizations, they appreciate that because that's essentially the kind of program that they follow. You start with baby steps, first of all, and you do things that are meaningful, and then you grow from there. Okay, so that resonates. But also what resonates among particularly the more modern Orthodox community, is the focus on mindfulness and the focus on intentionality, which I'm told is often something that is sometimes lost in some of those communities. So again, mindfulness, intentionality, really thinking things through, and that aspect of things is something that's very important in the remixed approach. All right, the third element is consistency. And this is particularly important when it comes to the transmission aspect. It's very hard to transmit tradition unless there's a consistent tradition that can be perceived. And so consistency is important. That doesn't mean that people will never backslide. That doesn't mean that people will always be perfectly consistent. But again, if ritual practice is something that is important, there does need to be a certain consistency to that which is observed. And along with that, it's important to focus on the joy. We do have so much of Jewish tradition that is joyful. Sure, we have a lot of do nots too, okay? Particularly as you get into the realm of the more observant, okay, the more observant sectors of Jewish tradition. But there's so much joy. There's so much joy in Jewish tradition. And that's the part that I think is especially important to focus on when transmission is the goal. And in keeping with that, there's also the idea that that it's important to approach the tradition through a respectful lens, as opposed to a lens that denigrates the tradition, even if you're not doing everything. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit with some examples, but I think that idea of respect for the tradition, even if it's not something that you're observing in a complete way, that approach is also so important as well. And lastly, there's the idea of authenticity. And this gets back to the question that motivated my work here in the first place. Remember, how much can a work of authorship be changed and still be the work of the author? And then that transfers to how much can Jewish tradition actually be changed and still be considered Jewish tradition? So that's, of course, the $64 million question, right? We struggle with that. I think for religiously liberal Jews, I often say that there are two A words, right, that are in competition with one another, but that really define their perspective, on Judaism and Jewish practice. So one of those words is authenticity, because there is a value that liberally religious Jews place on authenticity that's been written about by others. I've seen it in my own discussions and teachings. Authenticity is definitely valued. And by the way, the chapter on food in Remixed Judaism really taps into that idea and illustrates the importance of authenticity among religiously liberal Jews, especially in the context of food. But the other A word, what's the other A word? The other A word is autonomy, right? Autonomy is something that's so important to religiously liberal Jews. And so it's navigating that balance between authenticity on the one hand, autonomy on the other. And that balance is one that's going to look different in different communities. It's going to not be the same for all individuals or for all communities, but it's also important to appreciate the fact that when you're dealing with religiously liberal communities, navigating that balance is going to be the goal. At the end of the day, what I am really advocating for, and what is at the heart of my approach, is the importance of developing thicker religious cultural norms, thicker religious cultural norms. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is it's important to develop norms of practice that are not watered down, okay, but that have meat to them, that have body to them, right? So that's what I mean by thicker religious cultural norms. If you can consider like everybody's life as a pie, if you will, what I am advocating for is that the Jewish piece of that pie become larger. Okay, it's never going to be the whole pie. That's not going to be realistic, but for that pie to become larger. And that is a goal that we can try to recognize and advocate for, regardless of whether we are dealing with Jews who are conventionally religious or not, regardless of whether we're dealing with Jews who are married or not, regardless of whether we're dealing with Jews who are in-married or intermarried. Okay, the goal is the same. And because unless religiously liberal communities are going to be willing to commit energy, time, and resources to understanding how to deepen and thicken these religious cultural norms, it is true that the practice is going to dwindle away. And that's what keeps me up at night. And so for the congregations that have, such as yours, that have invited me to speak about remixed Judaism, I'm so grateful, because that's exactly the focus that institutions need to have. Because absent that focus, I worry, what will the entire Jewish institutional world look like? You know, and one of the things that was most interesting about especially the 2020 Pew Report that just came out was a correlation between Jews who are, you know, living a thicker Jewish life. Okay, those with thicker observances, there is a correlation between those Jews and their cultural practices. But for Jews who are less engaged Jewishly on the religious side, Pew shows they're also less engaged Jewishly on the cultural side. And so if you think about all the organizations, all the Jewish organizations, the federations, the service organizations, every single Jewish organization, what does it depend on? It depends on their being Jews, right? It depends on their being Jews. And so again, that's why I feel it's so important to try to deepen these religious cultural norms. So I wanted to actually read one passage from the book, from my book, Remixed Judaism. But before I actually read a passage from it, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the kinds of topics that I treat. And then I'm going to read a passage that sort of talks about an element of remix that I talk about in the book, because I want to give you a concrete example of remix. So first, let me talk about what it is that I address and why do I address these topics. So the first chapter of remix is about Shabbat and holidays, the foundation, the cornerstones of Jewish practice are Shabbat and holidays. And so that is my first chapter, and I apply this theory to Shabbat in particular, but the holidays generally. I also talk about marriage and Jewish marriage. And what does 21st century marriage look like? And so that is my second chapter. Food. Okay, I have a chapter on food. So this was sort of an interesting chapter for me to write, because I'm not really a foodie. I don't really like to cook, and I don't spend a lot of time reading cookbooks. It's just not my thing. And my agent told me when I was writing this chapter, she said, you know, you've got to tell the stories of the chefs. And I said to her, completely naive, how do I do that? How am I supposed to tell the stories of the chefs? And she is a foodie. And she said, you read their cookbooks. And I said, oh, okay. So I did. I went to my synagogue library. I got out every single cookbook that I could possibly find. And I found many, many, many stories of Jewish chefs. And what I've learned, interestingly enough, from these stories is that authenticity is so important to Jewish chefs, whether they keep kosher or not, whether their establishments are kosher or not. Authenticity is something that matters to them. And so, for example, Michael Solomonoff, who is a multi-time winner, James Beard Award winner, he is the proprietor of the restaurant Zahav in Philadelphia, where I understand you need, at least pre-COVID, you needed months out to get a reservation. He doesn't keep kosher personally. His restaurant is not kosher. However, he honors a few basic rules because his restaurant is Israeli cuisine, and he feels that you can't really have Israeli cuisine be authentic unless you are honoring these basic rules. So authenticity is clearly something that is important with food. And the other A word, autonomy, is something that's also important with food choices. I will put a plug in for a book that was published by the CCAR Press, the Reform Movement's press, called The Sacred Table, which really gives a reform ethic for keeping kosher. I read that book cover to cover. I talk a lot about that book in my food chapter. It's a phenomenal book, and it has so many examples of remix being exercised in the context of food. Another chapter talks about children's Jewish education and B'nai Mitzvah, and how that has been remixed substantially over the course of, especially the past 15 years. There's been so many developments in education. I talk about grandparenting. Okay, that's a book that I talk about how grandparents, and again, and that those themes apply to people, again, with special people in their lives who are not necessarily biological grandchildren, how grandparents can heighten the Jewish journeys of their grandchildren, or again, other special little ones. Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam is a really interesting topic for remix, because a lot of people feel that they exercise their Judaism through Tikkun Olam. And so Tikkun Olam is a remix in point, but it's also not necessarily enough in order to completely substitute for Jewish tradition. And I also conclude with death and dying and the mourning rituals, which actually have the strongest staying power among, I think, virtually any of the Jewish rituals. And I explore why that is true and how that can be remixed. All right, so what's an example of remix? An example of remix is actually lighting Shabbat candles after sundown. Okay, so according to Jewish law, Shabbat candles should be lit 18 minutes prior to sundown. And the reason for that is in the Torah, lighting fire, striking a match, is one of the few biblically prohibited activities on Shabbat. All right, so according to the norms of the tradition, the normative tradition, you do not strike a match. That's been extended to no use of electricity. Okay, but what about that? So and I get asked this all the time, including by my own kids, well, should I light candles after sundown? Because they're never home before sundown, especially in the winter, even after the winter in the summer. So should you light candles? And my answer to all of that, when people ask me that question, the first thing I say is, do you think it's a sin to strike a match on Shabbat? I always get the answer, of course, I don't think it's a sin to strike a match on Shabbat. And my answer to that is always, well, if you don't think it's a sin to strike a match on Shabbat, then you should light your candles after sundown. That's a difference, by the way, between like a remixed approach and something that Orthodox outreach organizations would do. They would never advocate lighting your Shabbat lights after sundown. But I feel that for purposes of deepening your connection to Jewish tradition, as well as transmission, it's important to mark out that space. So I'm going to, one of the narratives that I use a lot of narrative in remixed Judaism. I use Talmudic narrative, I use personal narrative, I use narratives from stories that I found. And this particular narrative is the story of Amy Guth, who is a journalist in the Chicago area. She actually was one of the op-ed thought leaders when I took the op-ed project 6 years ago. And Amy is Jewish. And this is her story about candle lighting. Okay, so Amy is a single woman. She's a journalist. And she is a journalist and a radio show host based in Chicago. And she's committed to weekly candle lighting. But since Shabbat in Chicago, as I said before, begins very early in the winter months, there are inevitably nights when the logistics trump everything, and that makes for a murky Shabbat start time. When that happens, Amy admits to a sense of fret when she is late to the dance. But it is never a question of whether or not to observe Shabbat. For her, Shabbat generally is less about halacha, laws, more about prioritizing the natural world's definitions of day and night, seasons and years, and of being in rhythm with the rest of my people. I love that phraseology. She feels an acute separation from her people when she cannot light her candles on time, because for her, each one of us, and I quote, each one of us who takes the time to light Shabbat candles and observe Shabbat adds to the collective light of her people. All right. Now, this is my language. Amy's personal attribution, remember, personal attribution is so important, for lighting candles emphasizes global Jewish peoplehood. But there are so many other ways those who light candles can ascribe meaning to this tradition. This capacity for creating a personal attribution is a critical element of a remixed approach to Jewish tradition. Lighting Shabbat candles is a means of connecting not just Jews living today in all parts of the world, but also with those who came before, our ancestors. I always think of my mother, father, and grandparents when I light candles. And interestingly enough, this past Friday night was my mom's birthday. It would have been her 97th birthday. And one of my daughters texted me that morning, and she said, when you light your Shabbat candles, you can communicate with Grandma Millie. And it's like, yes, that's exactly right. So that's that's just the idea of lighting your candles, but after sundown. That is a remix. That is a remix. Here's another cute remix story. And I think after I tell you this one, I would love to just like take some time, throw it up for questions and dialogue. So here's another cute remix story. One of my other daughters, her husband, I think this was sometime maybe just right prior to COVID, basically told her that he was no longer going to be eating any kind of pork products. And my daughter calls me up and she said, Mom, Jeremy's not eating any pork anymore. Well, I was like, I'm going to admit, because I'm kind of traditional in my practices. And I said, that's great. That's wonderful. And I said, so look, is he trying to connect more with his Judaism? And my daughter says to me, no, not at all. And I said, okay, well, what's going on? She goes, well, he feels badly for the animals. Okay, well, having read The Sacred Table, the book I mentioned before, I know that's a very big motivator, but then I remembered that his favorite food are hamburgers. And so I got a little confused and I said, well, is he giving up meat altogether? And she said, no, not at all. Then I said, all right, well, I don't get it. What's up? And she said, well, Mom, don't you know that the pigs, they're treated so much worse than the cows are? And I just like burst out laughing. It was like the funniest thing. I couldn't even like contain my laughter. But again, like to me, that's a remix. And she said, well, is it, you still think this is a good thing, even though he's not doing it for the right, the right reasons, whatever the right reasons are. And I said, yeah, sure. It's a good thing, right? Because not eating pork is one of the pillars of Jewish tradition. So anything that is being practiced, as long as it's consistent with your own personal meaning, it's something that they will continue to do, that a person will continue to do. So this is a good thing, and this is a remix. So I want to conclude with a quote from Rav Kook, who was the first chief rabbi of Israel prior to it becoming a state. And what he said was, I'll give you the Hebrew and then I'll give you the English. He said, Hayashan yitkadesh, which means the old shall become new, v'chadash yitkadesh, and the new shall become holy. That is not in the book. I actually found that quote just, maybe 6 months ago, but I thought it was a perfect encapsulation of what remixed Judaism is. And so with that, I would love to throw it out for questions and comments or any type of discussion.
Wow, thank you for that amazing presentation and really thinking about a different way to interpret, really a different kind of interpretation, not necessarily based in a halachic or Jewish legal explanation for why we do things, but really a variety of that. I see Michael has his hand up. Michael, want to unmute and ask Professor Kwall your question?
The Pew Report basically says at this point in time, the Chabad are way ahead of everybody else. And it's very interesting because I'm a member of 2 Reform synagogues in Los Angeles, and I occasionally go to Chabad. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's any membership dues anyway, but I go there. Yeah. And what is appealing to me is very singular, or maybe not so singular. I'm the grandson of an Orthodox rabbi in Philadelphia. I'm 83 and a half. All of that tradition that I go into Chabad and I think I'm entering my grandfather's synagogue in 1947.
Yeah.
And I entertain them with stories about my background, and they love the stories. The rabbi loves the stories. But the thing about Chabad is like your family doesn't like the way the pigs are treated, I don't like the way women are treated in Chabad, frankly, unless I'm missing something, but they stay in the kitchen. They give birth to babies. I can't imagine a Chabad rabbi like Denise Eger, or even, doesn't matter, the other one. So why is Chabad the way of the future if it puts down women, or doesn't it put down women and I just don't notice it?
Okay.
Your turn.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So first of all, you are correct. When you say it's not just Chabad, I mean, what Michael, right? What Michael, your point is absolutely correct, but it's not just Chabad that's growing. It's really all of Orthodoxy. Chabad is one form of Orthodoxy. There's other Hasidic movements, and there's a whole range of, Orthodoxy is actually the least monolithic of any of the movements. There's a huge range. But you are correct that Pew says that Orthodoxy is growing. I think a lot of the attraction that I hear to Orthodoxy in general, Chabad in particular, is that it's authentic. It goes back to that quest for authenticity. So on the women's issues, I just want to say one thing about that. So a television show, a reality television show, just came out I think it's been a month now, I think it's called My Unorthodox Life. And I watched one episode of it. And I got to be honest with you, I got really upset when I watched it. So upset that I penned an op-ed, which I was very fortunate to get published in the Jewish Journal based out in California. And what I said in that op-ed, and this goes to your point, is that, does that represent some pockets that show, and maybe even that notion of women that you're talking about? Yes, it does represent some pockets of Orthodoxy. However, right, the Chabad here in the town I live in, which I do go to sometimes, the rabbi's wife, I've known her for years at this point, and I once made the mistake of calling her, this is when I first met her, a Rebbetzin. And she looked at me and she said, Bobby, I am not a Rebbetzin. I am an equal partner with my husband. And I said, I will never make that mistake again. The thing is that, yes, there are things under Orthodox tradition that women cannot do. But that is there's a lot of nuance in that. The truth of the matter is more Orthodox women are learning Torah and Talmud and teaching and attaining the highest levels of recognition. The Oxford Handbook that I'm co-editing, 1/3 of those authors are women, 1/3, right? That's an amazing percentage in a field like Jewish law. So I feel like, yes, there is gender separation. Yes, there is not mixed seating. Yes, women cannot perform certain ritualistic functions. And in some communities, there is that idea that women are really there for procreation. But you can't categorize all of Orthodoxy like that, in my view. It's far more nuanced than that. And in general, the more insular the community, the more you're going to have that kind of mentality. But I will tell you that all of the Orthodox women that I deal with professionally and that I know, they're powerhouses, and they don't take second place to anyone. So that would be my response to that.
But they don't take part in the service. I stand there on Friday night, and the rabbi's wife is in the kitchen.
But that may be the norms of that particular Chabad. But, I've been to Chabad where women are praying very fervently. I've been to, other Orthodox synagogues where women are just as engaged in tefillah as the men. They're not leading the tefillah, but they're just as engaged. Maybe that's just the norms of that particular Chabad, but that's not necessarily universal, even for Chabad, is what I'm saying. So.
Thank you. Rabbi Kroll, jump in and share with us.
Oh, you could have just said Leah. I've been pondering your response to the time of lighting Shabbat candles, and your question was, do you consider lighting candles on, or lighting on Shabbat a sin. And I'm wondering why that was your question. And I'm going to, I guess, explain what I think the Reform response might have been, which is, when does Shabbat begin? Does it begin 18 minutes before sundown, or does it begin when the family gathers around the Shabbat table, no matter what time that might be? Like, given the traffic in LA, that might be at, in the winter, let's say at 7:00 p.m. when everybody gets home. And it doesn't have to do with sin or not. It has to do with the intentional, it has to do with intention of making Shabbat not tied to sin and not tied to a specific time. So I'm thinking about how wonderful it was being an Israeli citizen and living in Jerusalem and knowing exactly when Shabbat would begin and standing on my patio and hearing the siren and the quiet. And that's amazing. But that doesn't, to me, mean that that's when Shabbat begins.
Right.
So,
Let
me just say one more sentence. I have your book. I haven't started it yet. But to my understanding of what you meant by remixed Judaism was, you can take these mitzvot and remix them in a way to make them fit into your life. So and maybe I'm wrong because I haven't read it yet. So your question about, do you consider it to be a sin, really threw me for a loop.
Okay. I understand. Thank you. That's a really interesting question. So thank you for raising that. So first of all, I want to say I agree. I love your explanation about when Shabbat begins. I think that's a wonderful explanation. I really, I'm glad you shared that with all of us, with me and with all of us. So thank you for that. I like to feel like I learn from these presentations, as much as teach. So I really do appreciate that. Every work of authorship, okay, and this is something I've written about a lot, in my copyright days, really really comes from the soul of the creator, right? The soul of the creator who's creating it. So what may not have been intuitively obvious, right, unless you've read my book, is that I'm a very traditional Jew, okay? I'm not necessarily, I'm writing for a wide audience, most of whom are not, in the same framework in terms of ritual as I might be. So my response to that is coming from the place that I think your response is great, and I will probably remember that and use that as a addition to my responses in the future. So thank you. But like for me, it's about, do you feel bound to Jewish law, right? And so that is why my question was what it was. If you feel bound to Jewish law, you feel you're not going to be comfortable lighting after sundown. I do not light my candles after sundown. Okay. So, but if the person I'm talking to doesn't have that same frame of reference, then my answer, clearly our answers are the same. The answer is you have to mark that space for Shabbat, and you have to celebrate Shabbat when you have that, the space and the time and the family present to do that. So, but again, my response is coming from my perspective as an author, and my perspective is a more traditional one, which is why that was my response to that. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I guess it depends on who you're talking to. And I'm wondering if your response differs depending on the community you're speaking to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And oftentimes the person who asks me, I know what the answer is anyway, right? And in which case, then you go right to, no, of course you should light your candles whenever you have your family there. I mean, that again, it depends on who you're speaking to. That's always the case.
Thank you, Leah. Diane, I see you have a hand raised.
Thank you. I wrote my question in the chat, and I will read it, but actually I realize my question's a little bit different. I have a problem when the Orthodox follow their Rebbe's teachings, and actually these teachings are not authentic. Wearing a sheitel, for instance, I have met a local modern Orthodox rabbi who feels that this is completely antithetical to the intent of covering your hair, or the patrilineal, matrilineal debate. Right now, I know in Israel that one of the Olympians is patrilineal and they will not let him marry his wife in Israel. Luckily, this is bringing a lot of attention to it, and maybe there will be some changes. But as far as matrilineal and patrilineal, they don't acknowledge or even know that the patriarchs were practicing patrilineal descent. So I had a recent situation. There was a death in the family. I wanted to say Kaddish. I walked to the synagogue that was overseeing everything for Shiva, and it was divided, but their mechitza does not give 50% to women. It gives 2 inches on the side, 2 inches on the side. And the side that met me when I came in the door was filled with men because they were trying to deal with the 6 feet. So they were apart and felt okay going into the women's side. So I thought there was no place. It turned out there was another 2 inches on the other side, completely empty because, as Michael said, many of them were home cooking dinner or doing what they needed to do. So I feel I have anger towards the Orthodoxy, which I know is not conducive to great things, but it's because I constantly get from them, well, grasshopper, this is what our people do. And I know a lot of it. I know a great deal of it, except for obscure, little minutia, but I'm treated as less than a Jew. And of course, they have the Pew Report. They can say, but you are less than a Jew. It's going to lose if we listen to you. But that kind of condescension and what I think is hypocrisy, I find it a stumbling point.
Yeah. Listen, I mean, I think the views that you've just articulated are fairly common. I think it goes both ways. I think it's a problem generally. I mean, a lot of my writing, including my popular writing, is really based on pluralist notions. I'm very much a pluralist. I advocate for there being communication between all of the denominations, more communication than there is. I don't like the divides either. I think as a world we're too divided, let alone as a Jewish people. And so, I completely agree with you. I think people really just need to, I would say generally that everyone needs to sort of try to be more open to having dialogue and debate and discussion as a general matter, as opposed to, just having, So I'd like to, if I might, just kind of share a little story that sort of goes to your point about a personal experience I had after my book came out. So, my agent has always said to me, don't ever engage with critics. Don't ever engage with critics. Okay. So there was on Facebook, and I still don't quite understand how this popped up, but on Facebook, I found someone who was really critical of my book. It wasn't a formal book review. I don't even know, it wasn't on my feed. I don't remember how I saw it, but I saw it. And it was like, whoa, she doesn't even talk about God. I wasted my money on this book. It was like really, really, really critical. And I don't know what possessed me to not listen to my agent at that point. But maybe it was like just divine inspiration, if you will. But I actually responded to this gentleman, and I said to him, "Look, I said I think you're judging the book too harshly. This isn't a book about faith; it's a book about practice. And if you looked at the book, you would understand that." So we went from sort of a little bit on Facebook to DMing on Facebook. From there, we went to DMing. We went to email. Like we became email friends. Okay. He's a modern Orthodox guy, but very religious. Okay. So between that yeshivish and modern Orthodox world, lives in New York. And, you know, it has some interesting family dynamics, but nonetheless, he's very religious, was brought up very religious. Well, our friendship, if you will, on the email, we've never met or spoken, has progressed to the point where we now share articles with one another. I share him stuff that I write. He shares stuff with me that he writes. And in one of his recent emails, he actually said, I see now we are fighting the same fight, right? This is coming from someone who was basically calling my book blasphemy, you know, when he was first critiquing it. And it's because we dialogued with each other. We had conversation with each other. And I think that is so important. So is that going to happen all the time? No, of course not, because a lot of people don't want to have conversations. But I think that's the Jewish way. The Jewish way is conversation. So
Thank you.
Well, thank you for this amazing, very lively conversation and presentation today, Professor Kwall. I really appreciated reading your book and appreciated hearing your thoughts about ways to reinvigorate our connection to tradition without feeling that we have to observe every jot and tittle, as the word goes. Remix Judaism, here's the book. It's still available for purchase through Congregation Kol Ami on our website, and it's in the chat. I put in the chat the link to our website so that you can consider it. And again, thank you for your time, and we look forward to having you back and talking to us about your next adventure in Jewish law and Judaism. Again, thank you, everybody. Next Sunday at 4 p.m., Rabbi Sally Priesen, America's first woman rabbi, is going to recount her journey. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of her ordination as a rabbi, and this coming spring, and she's speaking around the country, and she'll be speaking specifically to us. So you can register for that and everything we do at Kol Ami at KOL-ami.org, kol-ami.org. Again, thank you for being with us. Thank you again, Professor Kwall, and for all of you for your questions and your time and attention. Have a great Sunday, everybody.
Bye. Thank you for having me.